Good evening and welcome to this evening coffee session. I hope your cup is all filled up. Mine is ready. Today we'll be looking at John Wesley's first sermon, which is titled Salvation by Faith. And it is extracted from Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8. So let us read it together. Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8, it reads as follows: For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourself, it is the gift of God. So we know that this sermon, John Wesley wrote it 3 weeks after the Aldersgate moment. So at that time, we know that he received a surety that indeed even his sins were forgiven. And so in the introduction of his sermon, he touches on 3 things. Firstly, he says that it is important to note that all of life's blessings are a free gift from God. So everything that we see in life, it is a free gift from God. And then one of the authors by the name of Holloway, when he explains what a gift is from God, he says a gift is something one receives without an expectation of a price to be paid or request to be made, but it is a gift for free and as a form of appreciation or blessing. And so John Wesley then secondly says that humans cannot do anything to atone for the sins themselves, meaning that there is nothing that one can be able to do in order to save themselves, but we require God's intervention for salvation. And then he says the only way for sinful humans to find favor with God is through God's grace. And we know by definition, God's grace or grace, it is the unmerited favor of God. And so he then summarizes this by saying that grace is the source of salvation and faith is the condition for salvation. So a source is something that you draw from. So meaning that in order for us to be able to receive salvation, we need to be able to draw from God's grace. And then the only condition that is required is to have faith in Jesus Christ. And so in his sermon then, he deals with 3 things. One, he deals and tries to explain what this saving faith is that Paul is talking about. And then secondly, he deals with the aspect of salvation. And then lastly, he deals with the doctrine of salvation by faith. And then so let's quickly look at the first one, the saving faith. So John Wesley says that this saving faith, it is the kind of faith that brings salvation. And then he says that this faith is not a matter of intellectual capability, and it is not a matter of any type of works, but it is basically a faith that brings salvation to one. And then secondly, he says this saving faith is the faith that one has in Jesus Christ, and one is able to find relevance to this when you look at Romans chapter 10 verses 9, which says that if you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And so John Wesley says that it is a sure confidence which man has in God that through the merits of Christ, his sins are forgiven, and then he is or she is reconciled to the favor of God. And then he says that is the saving faith that one needs to have. It is ultimately the faith in Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ died and was raised for our sins. And then he then deals with the second aspect of salvation. And then here, John Wesley says, what are we saved from? Why is it that we need this salvation? And then so he mentions the type of sins that we are saved from. Firstly, he says we are saved from habitual sin. This is any sin that becomes a habit in one's life. You know those habitual sins that we normally go through. He says then we are also saved from a willful sin. It is a sin that comes from your own personal will. It is when you decide that you are going to undergo a process or an act that will result in sin willingly. He says we are also saved from a sinful desire. That is the desire that will cause a person to sin when you are enticed by your own desires. And then lastly, he says that we are also being saved from the weaknesses in action, words, and thought, because we know that at times we falter and sin because of our action, our words, and our thoughts. And so he says these are all the types of sins that we are saved from. And therefore, he gives a definition to salvation, whereby he says that the simple definition to salvation is justification. And for me, justification is when you have been put just before God, is when Christ has taken your place in being judged, and then Christ takes the judgment on his shoulder. Justification is to be freed from the penalty of sin. That means then Christ takes the penalty that we were supposed to receive, and then he takes it upon his shoulder. And therefore, salvation is salvation from sin. It is also salvation from the consequences of sin. And then lastly, John Wesley then deals with the doctrine of salvation by faith. The doctrine of salvation by faith, it is also known as the sola fide, the doctrine of salvation by faith. And then after dealing with a number of objections with regards to the doctrine of salvation by faith, because Wesley says that at times this doctrine undermines the law of God, and it at times leads people into a sinful pride, because they think that you can be able to do works in order to receive salvation. But he says that no, there is nothing that one can be able to do to receive salvation, because works does not go alone, but you also need to have the grace and the faith. So you cannot just have works and think that if there is something that you can be able to do out of your own. And therefore he says that human beings have no capacity to save themselves. Our only reliance is on the redemptive act of Jesus Christ on the cross. And therefore he says that there is no human work, there's no human capacity that can be able to bring us to a point of salvation other than the redemptive act of Jesus Christ. And therefore, in closing, really, when John Wesley looks at the justification by faith in his sermon, basically he explains that the doctrine of salvation by faith, when he uses Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8, he say that which says, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, not that of yourself, it is a gift from God. Basically, Wesley explains that salvation does not only include prevenient grace, which is the grace that goes before us, but he says that it is a process, it includes a process of justification and sanctification. And justification, like we mentioned before, is to be freed from the penalty of sin, and sanctification is to be freed from the power of sin. That's how he explains then the doctrine of salvation. And therefore, in closing, he says, there is no human effort that can earn this salvation. This salvation is given by God as a gift. It is through God's grace, which is the unmerited favor of God that we have received. And in closing, he says that grace is the source of our salvation, and faith is what is needed in order for us to be able to receive it. And therefore, friends, we must also know that it is a gift from God which we did not work for, which we do not even deserve, but because of God's grace, because of the unmerited favor of God, we were able then to receive this salvation. Please join me again next week, Wednesday, as we are about to look at the second sermon by John Wesley, which we will announce in time what it will be. For now, have a blessed evening. Thank you.